In the beginning, there was the Nile, eternal and unchanging, flowing through a land that would become the cradle of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Long before the first pyramid pierced the sky, before the Sphinx gazed eternally eastward, there existed scattered tribes along the riverbanks, each worshipping their own gods, each following their own customs, unaware that they would one day unite under a single crown to create an empire that would endure for 3 millennia. The prehistoric peoples of the Nile Valley lived in harmony with the annual flood cycle, understanding that life and death, prosperity and famine all depended on the sacred river's rhythms. They developed agriculture, learned to work copper and gold, created pottery of remarkable beauty, and began to organize themselves into increasingly complex societies. These early Egyptians, known to us as the Nakada people, laid the foundations for everything that would follow. As centuries passed, 2 distinct kingdoms emerged from this ancient tapestry. In the north, the Red Crown ruled over Lower Egypt, a fertile delta region where the Nile split into many branches before meeting the Mediterranean Sea. The goddess Wadjet, depicted as a cobra, protected this northern realm. Here papyrus grew in abundance, and the people became skilled in crafts and trade, their settlements bustling with activity as boats carried goods to and from distant lands. In the south, the White Crown governed Upper Egypt, a narrow strip of fertile land carved from the desert by the Nile's persistence. This southern kingdom stretched from the first cataract at Aswan to the area around modern-day Cairo. Nekbet, the vulture goddess, watched over this realm where the people developed strong military traditions and perfected the art of working stone. The southern kings ruled from their capital at Hierakonpolis, a city whose very name would echo through the ages. For generations, these 2 kingdoms existed in an uneasy balance, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, each developing its own religious practices, artistic styles, and political systems. The rulers of both lands claimed divine authority, presenting themselves as earthly representatives of the gods. They built increasingly elaborate tombs, competed in displays of wealth and power, and gradually expanded their territories through conquest and diplomacy. The southern kingdom proved more aggressive. In its expansion, its rulers gradually gaining control over more territory and developing superior military organization. They perfected the use of the mace and the bow, created disciplined armies, and, most importantly, they learned to harness the Nile's power for both irrigation and transportation. Their ships could carry soldiers and supplies vast distances, giving them a crucial advantage over their northern rivals. Around 3100 BCE, a southern king, whose name has come down to us as Nama, though he may also have been called Menes, accomplished what many had attempted but none had achieved. Through a combination of military conquest, political alliances, and perhaps divine favor, he united the 2 lands under a single crown. This was not merely a political union, but a cosmic event that would reshape the very nature of Egyptian civilization. The unification was commemorated in the famous Nama palette, a ceremonial stone that depicts the king wearing both the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt. The imagery is powerful and deliberate. Nama strikes down his enemies, captures prisoners, and receives the submission of defeated cities. But this was more than mere conquest. It was the creation of a new type of kingship that would define Egyptian civilization for the next 3,000 years. With unification came the need for a new capital, a city that could symbolize the union of the 2 lands. Nama established Memphis, strategically located at the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt, where the Nile Valley opens into the delta. From this White Wall, as it was first known, the United Kingdom would be governed. Memphis became not just a political center, but a sacred city, home to Ptah, the creator god who was said to have spoken the world into existence. The early dynastic period that followed unification saw the establishment of institutions that would define pharaonic Egypt. The king was no longer merely a ruler, but a god, incarnate, the living Horus, son of Ra, the bridge between the mortal and divine realms. This divine kingship required elaborate ceremonies, magnificent palaces, and, above all, tombs worthy of a god. The earliest pharaohs were buried at Abydos, a site that would become one of Egypt's most sacred locations, associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife. These first dynasties also saw the development of hieroglyphic writing, a system that combined picture symbols with phonetic elements to create one of the world's most beautiful and complex writing systems. Scribes became a powerful class, for they alone could read and write the sacred symbols that recorded royal decrees, religious texts, and administrative documents. The ability to record information accurately meant that the pharaonic state could grow in complexity and efficiency, managing vast territories and populations with unprecedented precision. The pharaohs of the first and second dynasties established many of the traditions that would characterize Egyptian monarchy. They created the concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order that the king was responsible for maintaining. They developed elaborate court rituals, established a complex bureaucracy, and began the construction projects that would culminate in the Great Pyramids. Each pharaoh sought to outdo his predecessors in the magnificence of his monuments and the extent of his conquests. Religious beliefs evolved during this early period as local gods were incorporated into an increasingly complex pantheon. Ra, the sun god, began his rise to supreme deity status, while Horus remained the special patron of the pharaohs. The concept of the afterlife became more elaborate, with the king's journey to the next world requiring increasingly sophisticated preparations and more magnificent tombs. The unification also brought about significant changes in art and architecture. The early pharaohs commissioned works that combined elements from both northern and southern traditions, creating a distinctive Egyptian style that would remain remarkably consistent for millennia. Massive stone architecture began to replace mud brick construction for the most important buildings, while artists developed the characteristic Egyptian style of depicting human figures in profile with frontal torsos. Trade expanded dramatically under the unified kingdom as Egyptian expeditions ventured south into Nubia for gold and Gothic goods, north to the Levant for cedar wood and other commodities, and east to the Sinai Peninsula for copper and turquoise. The pharaoh's control over these trade routes brought immense wealth to Egypt and allowed them to finance ever more ambitious construction projects. The administrative system that developed during these early dynasties divided Egypt into nomes, or provinces, each governed by a nomarch appointed by the pharaoh. This system allowed for efficient collection of taxes, organization of public works, projects, and maintenance of order throughout the kingdom. The annual Nile flood required careful coordination of irrigation systems, storage of grain during abundant years, and distribution of resources during lean times. By the end of the Second Dynasty, around 2686 BCE, the foundations of pharaonic civilization were firmly established. The concept of divine kingship was universally accepted, the administrative machinery of the state functioned smoothly, and Egypt had begun to look beyond its borders for expansion and influence. The stage was set for the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid builders, when Egyptian civilization would reach its first great flowering and create monuments that would astound the world for millennia to come. The Third Dynasty dawned with a revolutionary vision that would forever change the landscape of Egypt and capture the imagination of humanity across millennia. King Djoser ascended to the throne around 2686 BCE, but his reign would be remembered not merely for political achievements, but for a single audacious project that reached toward the heavens themselves. Under the guidance of his brilliant architect Imhotep, a man so revered that later generations would worship him as a god, Djoser conceived of a tomb unlike any that had come before. At Saqqara, on the western bank of the Nile, near Memphis, rose the world's first pyramid. The Step Pyramid, as it would become known, began as a traditional mastaba tomb, but grew through 6 successive enlargements into a structure that stood 200 feet tall, its stepped sides ascending like a stairway to the afterlife. This was more than architecture. It was theology made manifest in stone, a physical representation of the pharaoh's journey from earth to heaven, from mortality to eternal divinity. Imhotep's genius lay not merely in the pyramid's design, but in his revolutionary use of stone. Previous monuments had been built of mud brick, but the Step Pyramid was constructed entirely of carefully cut limestone blocks. This innovation required new techniques, new tools, and new organizational methods. Thousands of workers had to be fed, housed, and coordinated. Quarries had to be opened, transportation systems developed, and construction techniques perfected. The building of the Step Pyramid marked the beginning of Egypt's great age of monumental architecture. The complex surrounding the pyramid was equally revolutionary. Enclosed within a massive limestone wall, the site included temples, courtyards, and subsidiary buildings that recreated the pharaoh's earthly palace in stone. Here, Djoser's Ka, his spiritual double, could continue to rule in the afterlife just as he had ruled in life. The complex included a Sedi festival court where the king could eternally perform the rituals that renewed his divine power, ensuring that his reign would continue forever in the realm of the gods. Djoser's successors attempted to build their own pyramids, but none achieved the perfection of the Step Pyramid. The Fourth Dynasty, however, would witness the culmination of pyramid building under a series of pharaohs whose names would echo through history: Sneferu, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. These kings would create the monuments at Giza that would become the sole surviving wonder of the ancient world. Sneferu, the first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, was a restless innovator who built not 1 but 3 pyramids during his reign. At Meidum, he began with a step pyramid, but later converted it to a true pyramid with smooth sides. The experiment was only partially successful, as the outer casing eventually collapsed, leaving behind the tower-like core that still stands today. Undeterred, Sneferu moved north to Dashur, where he built the bent pyramid, so named because its angle changes partway up, creating a distinctive profile that suggests the builders realized their initial angle was too steep to maintain safely. Not satisfied with these experiments, Sneferu built a third pyramid at Dashur, the Red Pyramid, which achieved the perfect proportions and construction techniques that his son Khufu would use to create the Great Pyramid at Giza. Sneferu's reign demonstrated the incredible wealth and organizational capability of the Old Kingdom pharaohs. His 3 pyramids required millions of stone blocks, thousands of workers, and decades of continuous effort. Yet, this was seen not as a burden, but as the natural order of things, for the pharaoh's successful transition to the afterlife ensured the continued prosperity of Egypt. Khufu ascended to the throne around 2589 BCE and immediately began planning a pyramid that would surpass all others. The Great Pyramid of Giza, originally standing 481 feet tall and covering 13 acres at its base, was the tallest human-made structure in the world for over 800 years. Its construction required approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 15 tons. The precision of its construction is astounding. Its base is leveled within just 2.1 centimeters, and its orientation to the cardinal directions is accurate to within 3/60ths of a degree. The logistics of building the Great Pyramid boggle the mind even today. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that a permanent workforce of around 2,000 skilled craftsmen was supplemented by rotating teams of up to 20,000 seasonal workers during the flood season when farmers could not work their fields. These workers were not slaves, as popular imagination suggests, but paid laborers who received rations of bread, beer, and onions. Their barracks, bakeries, and medical facilities have been discovered near the pyramid, revealing a well-organized construction community. The pyramid's internal structure is as impressive as its external appearance. The Grand Gallery, a corbelled passage that rises at a steep angle toward the king's chamber, demonstrates architectural sophistication that would not be equaled for centuries. The king's chamber itself, built entirely of red granite, quarried at Aswan, 600 miles to the south, houses a sarcophagus carved from a single block of granite. The precision required to transport these massive stones and position them within the pyramid's structure speaks to a level of engineering expertise that rivaled any civilization in history. Khufu's pyramid was not built in isolation, but as part of a complex that included smaller pyramids for queens, mastaba tombs for nobles, temples, and causeways. The entire Giza plateau became a city of the dead, carefully planned and executed according to religious and astronomical principles. The pyramid's passages align with specific stars, particularly those associated with Orion, which the Egyptians identified with Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Khafra Khufu's successor built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller than his father's, but built on higher ground, so that it appears nearly equal in height. More importantly, Khafra commissioned the Great Sphinx carved from a single outcrop of limestone left over from pyramid construction. The Sphinx, with its human head and lion's body, represents the pharaoh as the sun god Ra-Horakhti, eternally guarding the sacred necropolis. Standing 66 feet tall and 240 feet long, the Sphinx became one of Egypt's most iconic monuments. The final pyramid at Giza was built by Menkaure Khafra's successor. Though significantly smaller than the other two, standing only 213 feet tall, Menkaure's pyramid was notable for its use of granite in the lower courses of its casing, making it the most expensive pyramid ever built in terms of materials. The pyramid complex included elaborate temples and 3 subsidiary pyramids for queens, demonstrating that even as pyramid size decreased, the elaboration of associated structures continued to increase. The pyramid age reached its zenith during the 4th dynasty, but The enormous resources required for these projects eventually began to strain even Egypt's vast wealth. The pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties built smaller pyramids, though they compensated for reduced size, with increased textual elaboration. The pyramid texts, first appearing in the Pyramid of Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty, are the oldest religious writings in the world, providing detailed instructions for the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife. These texts reveal the sophisticated theological concepts that underlied pyramid construction. The pyramid was not merely a tomb, but a resurrection machine, designed to transform the dead pharaoh into an Ek, a transfigured spirit who could take his place among the imperishable stars. The pyramid's passages and chambers recreated the cosmic geography of the afterlife, while its orientation ensured that the pharaoh's spirit could join the sun god Ra in his daily journey across the sky. The Old Kingdom pharaohs ruled over a highly centralized state that extended from the First Cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north. This territory was administered through a sophisticated bureaucracy headed by the vizier, who served as the pharaoh's chief minister. Provincial governors or nomarchs administered the 42 nomes into which Egypt was divided, while scribes maintained detailed records of everything from tax collection to grain storage. The wealth that funded the pyramids came from Egypt's incredibly productive agriculture, supplemented by trade and tribute from conquered territories. The annual Nile flood deposited fertile silt across the floodplain, allowing Egyptian farmers to produce surplus crops that supported not only the agricultural population, but also the craftsmen, artists, priests and officials who created one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. Egyptian expeditions ventured far beyond the Nile Valley during the Old Kingdom, establishing trade networks that extended from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north and east. Gold from Nubian mines, cedar wood from Lebanese forests, and exotic goods from Punt on the Red Sea coast flowed into Egypt, while Egyptian manufactured goods, grain, and finished products were exported throughout the known world. The end of the Old Kingdom came gradually as the central government's power waned and provincial nobles gained increasing autonomy. Climate change may have played a role, as a series of low Nile floods led to famine and social unrest. The 6th dynasty pharaohs found themselves increasingly dependent on provincial governors, while the enormous costs of maintaining the royal cult and building projects strained the treasury. By 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom had collapsed into the chaos of the First Intermediate Period, but its achievements would never be forgotten. The pyramids stood as eternal witnesses to the pharaoh's divine power, while the artistic and architectural innovations of the period established canons that would influence Egyptian civilization for the next 2 millennia. The Old Kingdom had proven that human beings could indeed touch eternity, creating monuments that would outlast empires and inspire wonder across the centuries. The collapse of the Old Kingdom plunged Egypt into an age of darkness that would test the very foundations of pharaonic civilization. For over a century, the two lands lay fractured, divided among competing dynasties, ambitious nomarchs and foreign invaders who dared to claim the sacred titles once reserved for god-kings alone. The First Intermediate Period, as historians would later call this time of troubles, witnessed famines that stalked the land like vengeful demons, civil wars that brother against brother, and the apparent abandonment of Egypt by its protecting gods. In the north, a dynasty claiming legitimacy, ruled from Heracleopolis, controlling Lower Egypt and parts of Middle Egypt through a combination of military force and political alliances. These Heracleopolitan pharaohs maintained the fiction of universal rule, commissioning monuments and inscriptions that proclaimed their dominion over all Egypt, yet their actual authority extended little beyond the Delta region. They faced constant challenges from ambitious nobles, Asiatic infiltrators who had settled in the eastern Delta, and, most dangerously, a rival dynasty rising in the south. From Thebes, a provincial city that had been of little importance during the Old Kingdom, came the family that would restore Egypt's glory and establish one of history's most powerful dynasties. The Theban nomarchs, initially mere vassals of the Heracleopolitan kings, gradually extended their influence northward through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and religious propaganda that portrayed them as the true heirs of the pharaonic tradition. The Theban rise began modestly with Intif the Elder, who controlled only the southernmost nomes around Thebes and Aswan. His successors, bearing the names Intef and Mentuhotep, gradually expanded Theban territory through decades of careful campaigning. These early Theban rulers faced unique challenges, governing a relatively poor region far from the traditional centers of Egyptian power, yet they possessed advantages that would prove decisive. The loyalty of Nubian allies, who provided gold and military support, control of the southern trade routes, and, most importantly, the patronage of Montu, the Theban war god, who promised victory to his devotees. The conflict between Thebes and Heracleopolis raged for generations, transforming Egypt into a battlefield where competing armies marched back and forth across Middle Egypt, leaving destruction in their wake. Towns changed hands repeatedly, temples were sacked, and the carefully maintained irrigation systems that had sustained Egyptian prosperity for millennia fell into disrepair. Yet, this seemingly endless warfare also forged the Theban military into a formidable force, creating professional soldiers and innovative tactics that would serve the dynasty well in future conquests. Mentuhotep II, whose throne name Nebhepitra proclaimed him as Ra is the Lord of the Rudder, finally achieved what his predecessors had attempted for over 50 years. In the 39th year of his reign, around 2055 BCE, his armies broke through the Heracleopolitan defenses and captured Memphis, reuniting Egypt under Theban rule. The moment of victory was commemorated in reliefs and inscriptions that portrayed the king as a divine warrior, trampling his enemies and restoring Ma'at to the two lands. The reunification required more than military victory. It demanded the complete reconstruction of Egyptian civilization. Mentuhotep II faced the monumental task of rebuilding a shattered kingdom, restoring confidence in pharaonic authority, and recreating the administrative and religious institutions that had sustained the Old Kingdom. His solution was characteristically ambitious. He would build a new type of royal monument that combined the grandeur of the pyramids with innovations appropriate to the new age. At Deir el-Bahari, across the Nile from Thebes, Mentuhotep II constructed a mortuary temple unlike any that had come before. Built into the natural amphitheater of cliffs that formed the western boundary of the Theban necropolis, the temple combined architectural elements from Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolically representing the reunified kingdom. The structure featured terraced courts that led to a central pyramid, or mastaba, surrounded by colonnades that would inspire later architects including Queen Hatshepsut, who would build her own temple at the same site centuries later. The temple's design reflected the changed nature of pharaonic kingship in the post-Old Kingdom era, where the pyramid builders had emphasized the pharaoh's solar connections and his transformation into a star god. Mentuhotep II's monument stressed his role as the divine warrior who had restored order to chaos. Reliefs depicted the king in battle, receiving the submission of defeated enemies and performing ritual hunts that demonstrated his power over the forces of disorder. This martial imagery would become a characteristic feature of Middle Kingdom royal art. Mentuhotep II's long reign of 51 years allowed him to complete the work of restoration and establish the foundations for the Middle Kingdom's golden age. He reorganized the administrative system, appointing loyal followers to key positions while gradually winning over former enemies through a combination of clemency and strategic marriages. The nomarchs, who had grown powerful during the intermediate period, were allowed to retain much of their local authority, but they were bound to the throne through personal oaths and family connections that ensured their loyalty. The king also initiated ambitious building projects throughout Egypt, reconstructing temples that had been damaged during the civil wars and commissioning new monuments that proclaimed the restoration of divine order. At Karnak near Thebes, he began the construction projects that would eventually create the largest religious complex in the ancient world. The Temple of Amun-Ra, who had risen from obscurity to become Thebes' patron deity, received particular attention as Mentuhotep II promoted this formerly minor god to national prominence. Trade networks that had collapsed during the intermediate period were gradually restored under royal protection. Egyptian expeditions once again ventured south into Nubia, where they re-established control over the gold mines that had provided much of the Old Kingdom's wealth. To the northeast, diplomatic and commercial contacts were renewed with the Levantine cities, while to the southeast, the mysterious land of Punt was once again accessible to Egyptian traders seeking incense, exotic animals, and precious woods. The restoration of trade brought with it cultural exchanges that enriched Egyptian civilization. New artistic styles emerged that combined traditional Egyptian motifs with foreign influences, creating works of remarkable beauty and sophistication. Literature flourished as scribes composed works that reflected on the recent troubles and celebrated the restoration of order. The prophecy of Neferti and the instructions for King Merikare provided both historical accounts of the intermediate period and guidance for future rulers on how to maintain royal authority. Mentuhotep II successors. Mentuhotep III and Mentuhotep IV continued the work of consolidation and expansion. Mentuhotep III, whose 20-year reign was marked by prosperity and stability, launched ambitious expeditions to the Red Sea coast, where Egyptian miners extracted valuable materials from the eastern desert. These expeditions required massive logistical support, as thousands of workers had to be supplied with food and water in one of the world's most inhospitable environments. The reign of Mentuhotep IV marked the end of the 11th dynasty in mysterious circumstances. Some evidence suggests that he died without a clear heir, creating a succession crisis that was resolved by the intervention of his vizier Amenemhaf, who would become the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. Other sources suggest a more dramatic scenario, with Amenemhaf seizing power through a palace coup that eliminated his rivals and established a new royal line. Amenemhat, as he became known after his coronation, faced the challenge of legitimizing his rule while maintaining the stability that his predecessors had achieved. His solution was to move the capital north to a new city called Itji Tawi, Caesar of the Two Lands, located near the Fayum Oasis south of Memphis. This strategic location allowed him to control both Upper and Lower Egypt more effectively while positioning his government closer to the traditional centers of Egyptian power. The new pharaoh's instructions, a literary work attributed to him, reveals the paranoia and determination that characterized his reign. He warned his son and successor about the dangers of trusting anyone, completely describing assassination attempts and betrayals that had marked his path to power. Yet Amenemhat also demonstrated remarkable administrative skill, reorganizing the government, establishing new procedures for provincial administration, and creating a military system that would make Egypt the dominant power in the Near East. Amenemhat's most important innovation was the establishment of co-regency, a system whereby the pharaoh associated his chosen successor with him on the throne before his own death. This practice, which would become standard during the 12th dynasty, ensured smooth transitions of power and prevented the succession crises that had plagued earlier periods. The co-regency system also allowed experienced pharaohs to train their heirs in the complexities of royal administration. The assassination of Amenemhat, as recorded in the instructions, and the tale of Sinuhe demonstrated both the continuing dangers faced by Middle Kingdom pharaohs and the stability of the institutions they had created. Despite the king's violent death, his son, Senusret I, assumed power smoothly and ruled for 45 years, launching Egypt into its greatest age of prosperity and international influence. Senusret I proved to be one of Egypt's most capable pharaohs, combining military prowess with administrative genius and cultural patronage. His armies pushed Egyptian control deep into Nubia, establishing fortresses at strategic points along the Nile that would secure Egypt's southern border for centuries. These massive fortifications, built of mud brick and stone, were marvels of military engineering that could withstand prolonged sieges while controlling river traffic and protecting Egyptian mining operations. The wealth generated by Nubian gold and Egyptian agriculture funded ambitious construction projects throughout the kingdom. Senusret I rebuilt the Temple of Ra at Heliopolis, creating a structure so magnificent that later pharaohs would quarry its stones for their own monuments. At Karnak, he continued the expansion of the Amun Temple, erecting obelisks and halls that proclaimed Egypt's renewed glory to gods and men alike. The pharaoh's building activities extended beyond religious structures to include practical projects that improved the lives of his subjects. New irrigation canals were dug, existing waterways were deepened and maintained, and the Fayum Oasis was developed into one of Egypt's most productive agricultural regions. These projects required careful coordination between the central government and local administrators, demonstrating the sophisticated bureaucracy that the Middle Kingdom pharaohs had created. Literature and learning flourished under Senusret I's patronage, as the king encouraged scribes and intellectuals to produce works that would educate future generations about proper governance and social order. The Tale of Sinuhe, perhaps ancient Egypt's greatest literary masterpiece, tells the story of an official who fled Egypt during Amenemhat's assassination but eventually returned to enjoy royal favor under Senusret I. The work serves both as entertainment and as political propaganda, emphasizing the benefits of loyalty to the pharaoh and the superiority of Egyptian civilization over foreign lands. The reign of Senusret I established the template for Middle Kingdom greatness that his successors would follow and attempt to surpass. When Amenemhat II ascended to the throne as co-regent with his aging father, he inherited a kingdom at the height of its power. Its borders secure, its treasury full, and its influence extending far beyond the traditional boundaries of the two lands. Yet the new pharaoh understood that maintaining such prosperity required constant vigilance, diplomatic skill, and the occasional demonstration of military might that would remind Egypt's neighbors of the price of challenging pharaonic authority. Amenemhat I's 35-year reign marked a subtle shift in Egyptian foreign policy from the purely defensive stance of the reunification period to a more aggressive assertion of Egyptian interests throughout the Near East. The pharaoh's armies did not merely react to threats, but actively sought to expand Egyptian influence, establishing tributary relationships with Levantine cities and demonstrating Egyptian power through carefully planned campaigns that combined military objectives with opportunities for plunder and prestige. The famous treasure of Tod, discovered in modern times beneath the temple floor at this Middle Egyptian site, provides tangible evidence of the wealth that flowed into Egypt during Amenemhat II's reign. Silver vessels bearing the names of Aegean rulers, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and exotic materials from across the known world demonstrate the extent of Egypt's trade networks and diplomatic contacts. This treasure buried beneath the temple floor, perhaps during a time of crisis, represents only a fraction of the riches that Middle Kingdom pharaohs accumulated through trade, tribute, and conquest. Amenemhat I's building projects reflected both the kingdom's prosperity and the pharaoh's desire to leave permanent monuments to his reign. At Dahshur, he constructed a pyramid complex that, while smaller than the old kingdom giants at Giza, demonstrated sophisticated engineering and artistic refinement. The pyramid's subterranean chambers were decorated with elaborate reliefs and texts that ensured the pharaoh's successful transition to the afterlife, while the associated temples provided for his eternal cult. The pharaoh's most significant achievement, however, lay not in stone monuments, but in the administrative and diplomatic foundations he established for Egypt's golden age. His court became a center of international diplomacy, where ambassadors from distant lands came to pay homage and negotiate treaties. Egyptian scribes developed increasingly sophisticated methods of record-keeping and communication, creating archives that allowed the central government to manage its far-flung territories with unprecedented efficiency. Senusret II inherited this well-ordered kingdom and immediately set about expanding Egypt's agricultural potential through one of antiquity's most ambitious engineering projects. The development of the Fayum Oasis, begun under his predecessors, reached its culmination during his reign as Egyptian engineers diverted Nile water through a complex system of canals and dikes that transformed thousands of acres of marginal land into fertile agricultural territory. This project required not only engineering expertise, but also careful coordination with local communities and religious authorities who controlled the sacred lakes and springs of the region. The Fayum development demonstrates the Middle Kingdom pharaoh's understanding that Egypt's power ultimately rested on agricultural productivity. By expanding the amount of arable land available for cultivation, Senusret II increased the kingdom's capacity to support larger populations, maintain bigger armies, and fund more ambitious construction projects. The newly reclaimed land was settled with carefully selected colonists who owed their prosperity directly to royal favor, creating a population of loyal supporters in a strategically important region. Senusret II's pyramid at Lahun, built near the entrance to the Fayum, was strategically positioned to symbolize royal control over this newly developed region. The pyramid complex included a town for the priests and officials who maintained the pharaoh's cult, and the papyrus archives discovered at this site provide invaluable insights into the daily administration of a Middle Kingdom royal foundation. These documents reveal the complex economic relationships that bound together pharaoh priests, officials, and workers in a system that ensured both the maintenance of royal monuments and the prosperity of local communities. The reign of Senusret III marked the absolute zenith of Middle Kingdom power and the emergence of a pharaoh whose military genius would make him a legendary figure in Egyptian memory. Later generations would worship him as a god, remembering him as the great conqueror who extended Egyptian dominion to its furthest limits and struck terror into the hearts of Egypt's enemies. His 19-year reign was marked by constant military activity as Egyptian armies campaigned in Nubia, the Levant, and even, according to some sources, in distant Mesopotamia. Senusret III's Nubian campaigns were particularly significant as they established Egyptian control over territory far to the south of the traditional border at the First Cataract. The pharaoh's armies advanced beyond the Second Cataract, establishing fortresses at Semna and Kuma that marked the new southern boundary of the Egyptian Empire. These massive fortifications, built of mud brick and stone, were marvels of military engineering that could house large garrisons and control all river traffic moving between Egypt and the African interior. The boundary stela that Senusret III erected at Semna provides insight into the pharaoh's military philosophy and his understanding of the psychological aspects of warfare. The inscription declares that any Nubian who passes this boundary without permission is to be killed, while any Egyptian who allows such a crossing is to be severely punished. Yet the stela also offers friendship and protection to Nubians who submit to Egyptian authority, demonstrating the carrot-and-stick approach that made Egyptian imperialism so effective. Senusret III's military innovations extended beyond strategy and tactics to include significant administrative reforms that strengthened royal control over the army and the kingdom as a whole. He reduced the power of provincial nomarchs, bringing their territories under more direct royal administration and ensuring that military commanders owed their loyalty solely to the pharaoh rather than to local magnates. This centralization of authority allowed Egypt to mobilize its resources more efficiently and respond more quickly to external threats. The pharaoh's building projects reflected both his military successes and his desire to create monuments worthy of his achievements. His pyramid at Dashur, while following traditional design principles, incorporated innovations in construction techniques and internal arrangement that demonstrated the continuing evolution of Egyptian architectural expertise. The pyramid complex included elaborate temples and subsidiary structures that provided for the pharaoh's eternal cult while serving as symbols of royal power visible from great distances. Senusret III's most lasting achievement, however, may have been his transformation of the Egyptian military from a largely feudal force dependent on local levies to a professional army capable of sustained campaigns far from Egypt's borders. He established permanent garrisons in strategic locations, created specialized units for different types of warfare, and developed logistical systems that could supply armies operating hundreds of miles from the Nile Valley. These innovations would serve Egypt well during the coming centuries of international competition and conflict. The final great pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat III, inherited the military and administrative achievements of his predecessors and channeled Egypt's accumulated wealth and expertise into internal development projects that would make his 45-year reign remembered as the pinnacle of Middle Kingdom prosperity. Unlike his immediate predecessors, who had focused primarily on military expansion, Amenemhat III concentrated on maximizing Egypt's economic potential through ambitious engineering projects and careful resource management. The completion of the Fayum development project under Amenemhat III created what Greek visitors would later call Lake Moeris, an artificial reservoir that stored floodwater for use during dry years while providing irrigation for thousands of acres of newly cultivated land. The project required the coordination of thousands of workers over many years, demonstrating the organizational capabilities that the Middle Kingdom pharaohs had developed to an extraordinary degree. The economic benefits were immediate and substantial, as the Fayum became one of Egypt's most productive agricultural regions. Amenemhat III built two pyramids, one at Dashur and another at Hawara, near the Fayum, but his most famous monument was the Labyrinth, a massive temple complex at Hawara that ancient visitors considered one of the wonders of the world. This enormous structure, containing thousands of rooms and chambers connected by a maze of corridors, served as both a mortuary temple for the pharaoh and an administrative center for the Fayum region. The building's complexity reflected the increasingly sophisticated nature of Egyptian religious and governmental institutions. The pharaoh's mining expeditions to the Sinai Peninsula and the Eastern Desert brought vast quantities of precious materials into Egypt, funding and construction projects throughout the kingdom. Egyptian miners working under royal protection extracted turquoise, copper, gold, and semi-precious stones that were fashioned into jewelry, religious objects, and royal regalia of unprecedented beauty and craftsmanship. These expeditions also served diplomatic purposes, as they demonstrated Egyptian power to Asiatic tribes and established Egyptian claims to mineral resources in contested regions. Under Amenemhat III, Egyptian influence reached its greatest geographical extent, with diplomatic contacts extending from Nubia in the south to Anatolia in the north and from the Libyan desert in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. Egyptian goods, ideas, and artistic styles spread throughout the ancient world, while foreign craftsmen, scholars, and diplomats flocked to the pharaoh's court, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that enriched Egyptian culture while spreading Egyptian influence abroad. Yet, even as Amenemhat III's reign represented the height of Middle Kingdom achievement, signs of future troubles were already becoming apparent. The enormous costs of maintaining Egypt's expanded borders, supporting the royal cult, and funding ambitious construction projects strained even Egypt's vast resources. Climate change brought a series of unusually low Nile floods that reduced agricultural productivity just as the kingdom's expenses were reaching unprecedented levels. The pharaoh's long reign ended with questions about the succession that would plague his immediate successors. Amenemhat IV, who may have been Amenemhat III's son or adopted heir, ruled for only 9 years before dying without a clear successor. The throne passed to Sobek-Neferu, possibly Amenemhat III's daughter, who became one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right. Her 4-year reign marked the end of the 12th dynasty and the beginning of a gradual decline that would culminate in the Second Intermediate Period. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom came not through sudden catastrophe, but through the gradual accumulation of problems that even the most capable pharaohs could not entirely solve. Successive low floods weakened the agricultural base that supported the kingdom's prosperity, while the costs of maintaining Egypt's expanded borders and elaborate royal cult consumed increasing portions of the royal treasury. Provincial nobles whose power had been reduced during the height of the 12th dynasty began to reassert their independence as central authority weakened. Most ominously, new peoples were moving into the ancient world, driven by climate change, population pressure, and the search for better lands. These migrants, whom the Egyptians would know as the Hyksos, brought with them new military technologies, including the horse-drawn chariot and composite bow that would challenge Egyptian military supremacy. As the Middle Kingdom pharaohs grew weaker, these foreign peoples established themselves in the Eastern Delta initially as traders and mercenaries, but eventually as rulers, who would claim the pharaonic titles for themselves. The end of the Middle Kingdom marked the close of one of ancient Egypt's most remarkable periods, an age when pharaonic civilization reached a level of sophistication and international influence that would not be equaled until the New Kingdom empire builders created their vast dominions centuries later. The achievements of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs in military organization, administrative efficiency, engineering, and cultural development provided foundations that would sustain Egyptian civilization through the coming period of foreign rule and eventual renaissance. The sacred order that had sustained Egypt for over a millennium shattered like pottery dropped upon stone. Foreign warriors with strange gods and alien customs swept across the delta, their bronze-shod wheels grinding the ancient certainties into dust. The Hyksos, whose very name meant rulers of foreign lands, brought with them technologies of war that rendered traditional Egyptian military tactics obsolete and imposed upon the two lands a humiliation deeper than any conquest in pharaonic memory. These invaders did not arrive as a unified army, but as waves of migration that gradually overwhelmed Egyptian resistance through superior weaponry and tactical innovation. The horse-drawn chariot, unknown in Egypt before their coming, gave the Hyksos unprecedented mobility and striking power. Their composite bows, crafted from hornwood and sinew, could penetrate armor and strike targets at distances that Egyptian archers could not match. Most revolutionary of all, they brought bronze weapons of superior quality and new designs that made traditional Egyptian copper implements seem like children's toys. The 13th dynasty. Pharaohs weakened by succession disputes and economic difficulties proved incapable of mounting effective resistance. One by one, the great cities of Lower Egypt fell to the invaders or submitted without a fight. Memphis, the ancient capital, where Narmer had established the unified kingdom over a millennium earlier, opened its gates to foreign rulers who claimed the titles of pharaoh while worshipping gods whose names had never been spoken in Egyptian temples. Avaris, in the eastern delta, became the Hyksos capital, a bustling cosmopolitan center where Asiatic traditions merged with Egyptian customs to create a hybrid civilization that horrified traditionalist Egyptians. Here, Hyksos kings adopted pharaonic regalia and titles while maintaining their foreign religious practices and military organization. They built temples to their storm god Baal alongside shrines to Egyptian deities, creating a religious syncretism that reflected the complex cultural interactions of the period. The Hyksos did not merely conquer Egypt, they transformed it. Their introduction of new military technologies forced Egyptian craftsmen to develop new metallurgical techniques and weapon designs. Their diplomatic contacts brought Egypt into closer contact with the wider Near Eastern world, facilitating trade relationships and cultural exchanges that would enrich Egyptian civilization long after the invaders had been expelled. Most importantly, their rule demonstrated to the Egyptians that foreign conquest was possible, shattering the isolation and sense of invulnerability that had characterized earlier periods. Yet even as the Hyksos consolidated their control over Lower and Middle Egypt, resistance flickered in the south. The Theban dynasties, reduced to controlling little more than the area around their ancient capital, maintained the fiction of legitimate pharaonic rule, while carefully building their strength for the inevitable confrontation. These southern pharaohs, numbered as the 17th dynasty, walked a dangerous tightrope between accommodation and resistance, paying tribute to their Hyksos overlords, while secretly preparing for rebellion. The Theban resistance began modestly under pharaohs whose names are barely remembered, Intef-Sobekemsaf and others who maintained Egyptian traditions in their reduced domains while learning the military lessons that Hyksos supremacy had taught. They adopted the invaders' military innovations, training Egyptian warriors in the use of chariots and composite bows while preserving the religious and cultural traditions that legitimized their claims to the throne of the two lands. Kamose, the last pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, finally broke the uneasy peace that had prevailed between Thebes and Avaris. His decision to launch a war of liberation was motivated not only by political ambition but by religious conviction, as the young king believed that the gods demanded the expulsion of the foreign rulers who had defiled the sacred land. The war that followed would last for decades and transform Egypt from a conquered territory into the ancient world's greatest military power. Kamose's initial campaigns met with mixed success as his armies struggled to overcome the technological advantages that had given the Hyksos their initial victory. Egyptian charioteers, newly trained in the arts of mobile warfare, proved no match for their more experienced Hyksos counterparts, while Egyptian infantry armed with traditional weapons suffered heavy casualties when they encountered Hyksos forces equipped with superior bronze armaments. Yet Kamose persisted, gradually learning the lessons of warfare against technologically superior enemies. The young pharaoh's strategy combined military innovation with psychological warfare, as he proclaimed himself the divine champion sent by the gods to restore Ma'at to Egypt. His propaganda portrayed the Hyksos not merely as foreign invaders, but as agents of chaos who threatened the cosmic order that the pharaohs were divinely appointed to maintain. This religious dimension of the conflict inspired Egyptian resistance, while legitimizing the brutal methods that the War of Liberation would require. Kamose's most significant achievement was not military, but organizational, as he created the administrative and logistical systems that would enable his successors to sustain prolonged campaigns against well-equipped enemies. he established weapon workshops that could produce bronze armaments equal to those of the Hyksos, developed intelligence networks that provided information about enemy movements and intentions, and, most importantly, created the professional military establishment that would make Egypt the dominant power in the Near East. The pharaoh's death in battle, fighting against overwhelming odds to liberate his homeland, provided the final ingredient necessary for Egyptian victory, a martyred hero whose sacrifice inspired his successors to continue the struggle regardless of cost. Kamose's brother, Amose, inherited not only the throne, but also a war that had become a sacred crusade, a divinely mandated mission that could not be abandoned without betraying the gods and dishonoring the pharaoh's memory. Ahmose, founder of the 18th dynasty and creator of the New Kingdom, proved to be one of history's most successful military leaders, combining strategic vision with tactical innovation to achieve what had seemed impossible. His armies, equipped with weapons and tactics learned from their enemies, gradually pushed the Hyksos back toward their delta strongholds while liberating Egyptian cities that had endured foreign rule for over a century. The siege of Avaris, the Hyksos capital, became the defining moment of the Liberation War. Ahmose's forces, supported by a newly created Egyptian navy, surrounded the city by land and water, cutting off Hyksos supply lines and preventing reinforcement from their Asiatic allies. The siege lasted for years, becoming a grinding test of endurance that strained both sides to their limits while demonstrating Egyptian determination to complete the work of liberation regardless of cost. The fall of Avaris marked more than a military victory. It represented the rebirth of Egyptian civilization and the beginning of an imperial age that would see Egyptian armies march to the Euphrates River and Egyptian influence extend from Nubia to Anatolia. Ahmose's soldiers, hardened by years of warfare against sophisticated enemies, had become the finest military force in the ancient world, while Egyptian military technology had evolved to match or exceed that of any potential rival. Yet Ahmose understood that military victory alone would not secure Egypt's future, as the Hyksos invasion had demonstrated the vulnerability of a civilization that focused entirely on internal development while ignoring external threats. His solution was revolutionary. Egypt would no longer wait passively for enemies to attack, but would actively seek to control its strategic environment through conquest, alliance, and diplomatic intimidation. The pharaoh's pursuit of the fleeing Hyksos into Palestine marked the beginning of Egyptian imperialism in Asia, as Ahmose's armies besieged and captured Sharohen, a fortified city that had served as a Hyksos refuge. This campaign established the precedent for Egyptian intervention in Asiatic affairs, while demonstrating to potential enemies that Egypt's reach now extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of the two lands. Ahmose's southern campaigns were equally significant as Egyptian forces pushed deep into Nubia to re-establish control over the gold mines and trade routes that had financed the Middle Kingdom's prosperity. These expeditions encountered fierce resistance from Nubian kingdoms that had grown powerful during the period of Egyptian weakness, leading to battles that tested the newly reformed Egyptian military against different enemies and challenging terrain. The successful completion of these campaigns gave Ahmose control over territories far exceeding those ruled by any previous pharaoh, stretching from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the southern borders of Palestine. More importantly, they established the military and administrative precedents that would guide Egyptian imperial policy for the next 5 centuries, creating systems of control and exploitation that would make Egypt the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the ancient world. Ahmose's domestic policies were equally revolutionary as he restructured Egyptian society to support the military establishment that his conquests required. The old feudal system based on local nobility and provincial autonomy gave way to a centralized administration staffed by professional soldiers and bureaucrats who owed their positions to royal favor rather than hereditary privilege. This new system proved far more efficient at mobilizing Egypt's resources for military purposes while ensuring the loyalty of the governing class. The pharaoh's building projects, while less monumental than those of his Old and Middle Kingdom predecessors, reflected the changed nature of Egyptian kingship in the imperial age. Instead of massive pyramids that proclaimed the pharaoh's divine nature, Ahmose commissioned temples and palaces that celebrated military victory and imperial dominion. These structures incorporated architectural elements and decorative motifs borrowed from conquered territories, creating a distinctively new kingdom style that reflected Egypt's new role as the center of a multi-ethnic empire. Religious developments during Ahmose's reign laid the foundations for the theological innovations that would characterize the new kingdom. Amun, the Theban god who had supported the liberation war, began his transformation into Amun-Ra, the supreme deity whose worship would dominate Egyptian religion for the next millennium. This theological evolution reflected the political reality of Theban supremacy while providing religious justification for Egyptian imperialism as the divinely mandated spread of Ma'at throughout the known world. The death of Ahmose marked not the end of Egyptian expansion, but its transformation from desperate liberation war into systematic imperial conquest. His successors inherited not merely a reunified kingdom, but the most formidable military machine. The ancient world had yet seen an instrument of divine will that would carry Egyptian power to the distant shores of the Euphrates and establish pharaonic dominion over an empire spanning 3 continents. Amenhotep I Ahmose's son and heir consolidated his father's achievements while pushing Egyptian influence deeper into Nubia and Palestine. His 21-year reign established the administrative frameworks that would govern Egypt's empire for centuries, creating systems of tribute collection, garrison maintenance, and local administration that transformed conquered territories into profitable provinces. Yet Amenhotep's most lasting achievement was the establishment of the Valley of the Kings, the royal necropolis that would house the mummies of New Kingdom pharaohs in tombs carved deep into the Theban mountains. The choice of this hidden valley, protected by the pyramid-shaped peak of Al-Qurn, reflected the changed security situation that Egyptian rulers faced in the imperial age. Unlike their Old and Middle Kingdom predecessors, who had built highly visible pyramid complexes that proclaimed their divine status to all who passed, New Kingdom pharaohs required tombs that could be hidden from potential grave robbers and foreign invaders. The Valley of the Kings provided the perfect solution, a secluded location that could be easily guarded while offering proximity to the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, where the pharaoh's mortuary cults would be maintained. Thutmose, I ascended to the throne. Through marriage to Ahmose Nefertari, daughter of Ahmose. establishing a precedent for royal succession that would complicate Egyptian politics for generations. His reign marked the beginning of Egypt's greatest age of military expansion as the pharaoh's armies pushed Egyptian control to its furthest limits while establishing the diplomatic and administrative systems that would sustain the empire at its height. The pharaoh's Nubian campaigns extended Egyptian control beyond the Fourth Cataract deep into the African interior where previous pharaohs had never ventured. These expeditions encountered sophisticated kingdoms with their own military traditions and defensive systems, leading to battles that tested Egyptian tactical innovations against enemies who had learned to counter traditional pharaonic military methods. Thutmose's victory at Kerma, the capital of the Kingdom of Kush, eliminated the last major threat to Egyptian dominance in Nubia, while securing access to gold mines that would finance future conquests. Yet, it was in Asia that Thutmose I achieved his most spectacular victories, leading Egyptian armies across the Sinai Peninsula and through Palestine to reach the Euphrates River, where he erected a victory stela that proclaimed Egyptian dominion to the boundaries of the known world. This campaign, covering over 1,000 miles of hostile territory, demonstrated the logistical capabilities that Egyptian military organization had achieved while establishing Egyptian claims to territories that would be contested for centuries. The encounter with Mitanni, the great Hurrian kingdom that controlled much of northern Mesopotamia, introduced Egypt to diplomatic and military challenges unlike any it had previously faced. Unlike the relatively primitive enemies that Egyptian armies had defeated in Nubia and southern Palestine, Mitanni possessed sophisticated military technology, professional armies, and diplomatic networks that extended throughout the Near East. The conflict that developed between these two great powers would dominate international relations for over a century. Thutmose I's building projects reflected both his military achievements and his understanding of the propaganda value of monumental architecture. At Karnak, he added pylons, courts, and obelisks that celebrated his victories while expanding the temple complex into the largest religious site in the ancient world. These monuments served multiple purposes. They honored the gods who had granted victory, provided employment for Egyptian craftsmen and laborers, and created lasting symbols of pharaonic power that would inspire future generations while intimidating potential enemies. The pharaoh's death created a succession crisis that would reshape Egyptian kingship and produce one of history's most remarkable rulers. Thutmose II, the designated heir, was a weak king who died young after a brief and undistinguished reign, leaving the throne to his infant son Thutmose III. The regency that followed brought to power Hatshepsut, Thutmose III's daughter, and Thutmose II's widow, who would rule Egypt for 22 years as one of its most successful pharaohs. Hatshepsut's assumption of full pharaonic powers, including the adoption of royal regalia and the false beard that symbolized divine kingship, represented a revolutionary moment in Egyptian history. No woman had previously claimed such complete authority, and her success required careful manipulation of religious traditions, political alliances, and propaganda that portrayed her rule as divinely ordained rather than revolutionary usurpation. The female pharaoh's reign focused on internal development and international trade, rather than military conquest, marking a deliberate shift from the aggressive expansionism of her predecessors. Her most famous achievement, the expedition to Punt, demonstrated Egyptian naval capabilities while securing access to incense gold and exotic animals that enhanced Egypt's prestige and religious practices. The reliefs depicting this expedition carved on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari provide detailed information about ancient African geography, flora and fauna, while celebrating Egyptian technological and organizational superiority. Hatshepsut's building projects rivaled those of any pharaoh in Egyptian history, combining architectural innovation with artistic excellence to create monuments that proclaimed her legitimacy while advancing Egyptian cultural development. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs of the Theban mountains, represented a masterpiece of architectural integration with the natural environment while incorporating design elements that would influence Egyptian building for centuries. The temple's terraced design, connected by ramps and colonnades that led visitors gradually upward toward the sanctuary carved into the living rock, created a sense of ascending toward the divine realm that perfectly captured the theological concepts underlying pharaonic funeral practices. The structure's integration with the surrounding cliffs demonstrated Egyptian architects' mastery of their environment while creating a monument that seemed to grow naturally from the sacred landscape. Hatshepsut's obelisks at Karnak, hewn from single blocks of granite, quarried at Aswan and transported over 600 miles to Thebes, represented triumphs of engineering that rivals envied and successors attempted to surpass. The inscriptions on these monuments, recording the pharaoh's achievements and divine connections, established literary precedents that would influence royal propaganda for centuries while providing invaluable historical information about Egyptian imperial administration. Yet, Hatshepsut's greatest achievement may have been her successful management of the complex relationship with her stepson Thutmose III, the rightful heir, whose eventual assumption of full pharaonic powers could have led to civil war. Instead, she appears to have gradually transferred authority to him during her later years, ensuring a smooth transition that preserved Egypt's stability while allowing the young king to begin the military campaigns that would make him one of history's greatest conquerors. Thutmose III's assumption of sole rule around 1479 BCE unleashed military genius that had been constrained during the peaceful years of Hatshepsut's regency. The young pharaoh immediately began planning campaigns that would not merely restore Egyptian influence in Asia, but would extend pharaonic dominion further than any previous ruler had dreamed possible. His first target was a coalition of Asiatic cities led by the king of Kadesh, who had taken advantage of Egypt's apparent weakness during Hatshepsut's reign to assert independence from pharaonic authority. The Battle of Megiddo, fought in 1457 BCE, established Thutmose III's reputation as a military strategist of the first rank, while demonstrating the tactical innovations that would characterize his campaigns. Rejecting the safe but predictable route suggested by his generals, the pharaoh led his army through the narrow and dangerous Aruna Pass, surprising the enemy coalition and achieving a crushing victory that restored Egyptian prestige throughout the Near East. The siege of Megiddo that followed the battle demonstrated Egyptian logistical capabilities while establishing siege techniques that would be used throughout the pharaoh's subsequent campaigns. Egyptian engineers constructed elaborate fortifications that completely surrounded the city, preventing escape or reinforcement, while systematically destroying the defenders' will to resist. The 7-month siege, tested Egyptian organizational abilities while providing training for the prolonged campaigns that would follow. Thutmose III's subsequent campaigns, 17 in total over a period of 20 years, systematically extended Egyptian control throughout Palestine and Syria, while establishing the diplomatic and administrative systems that would govern Egypt's Asiatic empire. Each campaign built upon the achievements of its predecessors, gradually wearing down enemy resistance while incorporating conquered territories into an integrated imperial system that channeled wealth and resources toward Egypt. The pharaoh's greatest triumph came with the capture of Kadesh, the fortress city that had anchored Asiatic resistance to Egyptian expansion. This victory eliminated the last major obstacle to Egyptian control of the Levant, while establishing Egyptian influence over trade routes that connected the Mediterranean coast with the interior of Asia. The wealth that flowed to Egypt from these conquests funded building projects throughout the kingdom while supporting the military establishment that maintained imperial dominion. Thutmose III's crossing of the Euphrates River, following in his grandfather's footsteps, but achieving even greater success, marked the high point of Egyptian imperial expansion. Egyptian armies advanced deep into Mitannian territory, capturing cities and imposing tribute obligations that acknowledged pharaonic supremacy over the entire Near East. The victory stela that Thutmose erected beside his grandfather's monument proclaimed Egyptian dominion to the limits of the civilized world. The pharaoh's naval innovations proved equally significant as Egyptian fleets gained control of the eastern Mediterranean while establishing bases that could support future campaigns and protect Egyptian trade routes. These naval expeditions encountered Greek and Anatolian peoples who would later play important roles in Near Eastern politics, establishing diplomatic contacts that would influence Egyptian foreign policy for centuries. Thutmose III's administrative genius proved as important as his military victories as he created the governmental systems that would manage Egypt's vast empire while ensuring the continued flow of tribute and resources that sustained imperial power. His appointment of loyal Egyptian officials to govern conquered territories, balanced by the preservation of local customs and religious practices, established precedents for imperial administration that would be copied by later empires. The pharaoh's building projects throughout Egypt reflected the wealth and cultural influences that imperial expansion had brought to the kingdom. At Karnak, he added halls, pylons, and sanctuaries that celebrated his victories while incorporating artistic and architectural elements borrowed from conquered territories. These monuments served as permanent records of Egyptian achievement while providing religious justification for continued imperial expansion. The festival hall at Karnak, built to commemorate Thutmose III's Jubilee celebrations, included reliefs depicting exotic plants and animals brought from conquered territories, creating a visual encyclopedia of Egyptian imperial reach while celebrating the pharaoh's role as master of the natural world. These artistic innovations influenced Egyptian decorative arts for centuries while establishing iconographic traditions that would characterize imperial Egyptian culture. The death of Thutmose III in 1425 BCE marked the end of Egypt's greatest age of conquest and the beginning of a period when the empire would face challenges that military might alone could not overcome. His successors inherited not merely vast territories and tributary states, but a complex web of international relationships, religious obligations, and administrative responsibilities that would test pharaonic authority in ways that earlier rulers had never imagined. The very success of Egyptian imperialism had created problems that would ultimately threaten the foundations of pharaonic civilization itself. Amenhotep I, son of the great conqueror, proved himself a worthy heir to the military traditions of his house through campaigns that maintained Egyptian dominance while demonstrating that the empire's power remained undiminished. His brutal suppression of rebellions in Palestine and Syria, commemorated in reliefs that depicted the pharaoh personally executing enemy leaders, sent clear messages to potential rebels throughout the empire while establishing his reputation as a ruler who would tolerate no challenges to Egyptian authority. Yet, beneath the surface displays of imperial confidence, fundamental changes were transforming Egyptian society in ways that would eventually challenge the very nature of pharaonic kingship. The wealth flowing into Egypt from conquered territories created new social classes and altered traditional relationships between pharaoh nobles and commoners. Military officers who had distinguished themselves in imperial campaigns demanded rewards that elevated them above hereditary aristocrats, while priests who administered the cults of newly important gods gained influence that rivaled that of traditional court officials. The reign of Thutmose IV witnessed the first clear signs of the religious revolution that would convulse Egypt in the following generation. The young pharaoh's famous dream stela, erected between the paws of the great Sphinx at Giza, recorded a vision in which the sun god promised him the throne in exchange for clearing sand from the ancient monument. This seemingly innocent act of royal piety actually represented a significant theological statement, as it emphasized the pharaoh's direct relationship with the solar deity, while bypassing the traditional priestly hierarchies that had previously mediated between kings and gods. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied these religious changes proved equally significant, as Egypt abandoned its traditional policy of imperial expansion in favor of international diplomacy, based on mutual recognition and strategic marriages. The Amarna letters discovered centuries later in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital reveal a world where Egyptian pharaohs corresponded with Babylonian, Assyrian, and Mitannian kings as equals, rather than subjects negotiating marriages, trade agreements, and territorial disputes through diplomatic channels rather than military conquest. Amenhotep III ascended to the throne at the height of Egypt's imperial prosperity, inheriting an empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. His 38-year reign represented the golden age of New Kingdom civilization, a period when Egyptian wealth, artistic achievement, and international influence reached levels that would never again be equaled. Yet, this very prosperity contained the seeds of the religious and political crisis that would soon shake Egyptian civilization to its foundations. The pharaoh's building projects surpassed those of any ruler since the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom, transforming Thebes into a city of unprecedented magnificence, while creating monuments throughout Egypt that proclaimed imperial glory to gods and men alike. The Temple of Luxor, connected to Karnak by a processional avenue lined with sphinxes, created a sacred landscape that embodied Egyptian theological concepts while providing venues for the elaborate festivals that celebrated pharaonic divinity and imperial achievement. At Malkata, on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes, Amenhotep III constructed a palace complex that functioned as the administrative center of the Egyptian empire while serving as a showcase for the artistic and cultural achievements that imperial wealth had made possible. Foreign ambassadors who visited this palace encountered a court of unprecedented sophistication where Egyptian nobles wore clothes of the finest linen, decorated with gold and precious stones, where exotic animals from throughout the empire roamed carefully tended gardens, and where the pharaoh himself appeared as a living god whose every word carried the authority of divine command. The religious developments that characterized Amenhotep III's later years laid the groundwork for the revolution that his son would unleash upon Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh's identification with the sun god Ra became so complete that he commissioned monuments depicting himself as a solar deity, while his courtiers began to worship him as a god during his own lifetime. These developments, while following logical extensions of traditional pharaonic theology, represented a fundamental shift toward the monotheistic concepts that would soon challenge the entire Egyptian religious system. Queen Tiye, Amenhotep III's principal wife, and the mother of his heir, played an increasingly important role in governmental affairs as the pharaoh aged and withdrew from active administration. Her correspondence with foreign rulers, preserved in the Amarna archive, reveals a woman of remarkable intelligence and political skill who maintained Egypt's international relationships while managing the complex court politics that surrounded the succession question. Her influence over her son would prove crucial in shaping the religious revolution that was about to transform Egyptian civilization. The prince, who would become Amenhotep IV and, later, Akhenaten, grew up in a court where traditional religious boundaries were already being challenged and where Egyptian contact with foreign cultures had created an atmosphere of intellectual ferment that encouraged questioning of established beliefs and practices. His education included exposure to international diplomatic correspondence, foreign religious concepts and artistic traditions that would profoundly influence his later revolutionary programs. The young pharaoh's coronation in 1353 BCE initially followed traditional patterns as he adopted the conventional royal titles and began construction projects at Karnak that honored Amun-Ra and other established deities. Yet, within a few years, he had begun the most radical religious revolution in Egyptian history, abandoning the traditional pantheon in favor of exclusive worship of the Aten, the solar disk whose rays ended in hands that bestowed life upon the royal family and through them upon all of Egypt. The theological implications of Atenism challenged every aspect of traditional Egyptian religion, and, by extension, the entire social and political order that had sustained pharaonic civilization for over 2 millennia. By declaring the Aten to be the sole god and himself to be the deity's exclusive earthly representative, Akhenaten eliminated the priestly hierarchies that had previously shared religious authority while concentrating unprecedented power in royal hands. This theological revolution required parallel changes in art, architecture, and court ceremony that created an entirely new aesthetic that broke dramatically with traditional Egyptian artistic conventions. The reliefs and sculptures produced during the Amarna period depicted the royal family in intimate domestic scenes that would have been unthinkable under traditional artistic conventions, showing the pharaoh playing with his children, embracing his wife, and engaging in everyday activities that emphasized his humanity while paradoxically strengthening claims to his divinity. These artistic innovations reflected the theological doctrine that the Aten could be approached only through the royal family, making the pharaoh and his queen the exclusive mediators between the god and humanity. Akhenaten's decision to abandon Thebes and establish a new capital at Amarna represented more than a change of residence. It constituted a complete rejection of the religious and political traditions that had sustained Egyptian civilization since the unification of the two lands. The new city, built on virgin ground with no previous religious associations, was designed according to Atenist principles that emphasized the solar deity's universal dominion while creating architectural settings for the new religious practices that the pharaoh was imposing upon his subjects. The construction of Amarna required enormous resources and organizational effort, as thousands of workers had to be transported to the site along with the materials needed to build a capital city from nothing. The speed with which the city was completed demonstrates the administrative efficiency that Egyptian bureaucracy had achieved, but it also reveals the enormous costs that the religious revolution imposed upon Egypt's economy, at a time when the empire was already facing external pressures that required careful resource management. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, provide invaluable insights into the international situation during the pharaoh's reign, while revealing the diplomatic consequences of his domestic revolutionary program. Foreign rulers who had previously maintained stable relationships with Egypt found themselves dealing with a pharaoh whose religious obsessions distracted him from imperial administration and whose radical policies created uncertainties about Egypt's future foreign policy commitments. The correspondence reveals a world in crisis as the great powers of the Near East competed for advantage, while smaller states sought protection from stronger neighbors. The kingdom of Mitanni, Egypt's traditional ally, faced increasing pressure from the rising Assyrian Empire, while Hittite expansion threatened to upset the balance of power that had maintained relative stability throughout the region. Egypt's failure to respond effectively to these challenges reflected Akhenaten's preoccupation with religious reform at the expense of imperial responsibilities. The rebellion of Aziru of Amuru, documented in detail in the Amarna letters, illustrates the consequences of Egyptian diplomatic passivity during the Amarna period. Despite desperate appeals from loyal vassals who warned of Aziru's treachery and requested Egyptian military intervention, Akhenaten failed to take decisive action, allowing a key territory to defect to the Hittites, while demonstrating to other vassals that Egyptian protection could no longer be relied upon in times of crisis. Similar crises erupted throughout Egypt's Asiatic empire as local rulers tested Egyptian resolve and found it wanting. The pharaoh's reluctance to engage in military campaigns that would have conflicted with his religious convictions created a power vacuum that Egypt's enemies were quick to exploit. Cities that had paid tribute to Egypt for generations declared independence, while former allies aligned themselves with rising powers that seemed more capable of providing effective protection. The domestic consequences of Akhenaten's religious revolution proved equally destabilizing, as the suppression of traditional deities and the dismantling of their temple establishments created opposition throughout Egyptian society. Priests who had lost their positions and income craftsmen whose skills were no longer needed for traditional religious art, and nobles whose authority had depended upon relationships with suppressed cults, all had reasons to oppose the new religious order. The pharaoh's apparent neglect of traditional royal obligations, including the maintenance of Maat and the performance of rituals that ensured Egypt's prosperity, created anxiety among ordinary Egyptians who feared that divine displeasure would bring catastrophe upon the land. Natural disasters, military defeats, and economic difficulties that occurred during the Amarna period were interpreted as evidence that the gods were angry with Egypt's abandonment of proper religious observances. The Queen Nefertiti's prominent role in Atenist religious ceremonies, including her performance of rituals traditionally reserved for male rulers, challenged conventional concepts of royal authority while creating additional opposition to the revolutionary regime. Her unprecedented visibility in royal art and inscriptions suggested that she might even have ruled as co-pharaoh during Akhenaten's later years, a possibility that would have violated every precedent in Egyptian royal tradition. The mysterious disappearance of Nefertiti from royal monuments during the final years of Akhenaten's reign has generated scholarly debate about whether she died, fell from favor, or assumed a new identity as co-ruler. Some evidence suggests that she may have ruled briefly as the pharaoh Neferuaten, attempting to moderate her husband's radical policies while preparing for the restoration of traditional religious practices that would follow his death. Akhenaten's death around 1336 BCE created a succession crisis that reflected the fundamental instability that his revolutionary policies had created within Egyptian society. The pharaoh's heir, the young prince who would become Tutankhamun, inherited a kingdom in crisis, an empire in rebellion, and a religious system that had alienated much of the population while failing to provide the spiritual and practical guidance that Egyptian civilization required. The child who ascended to the throne as Tutankhaten in 1332 BCE inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse, an empire whose vassal states had begun to drift away like boats cut loose from their moorings, and a religious system that had alienated the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. At barely 9 years of age, the boy pharaoh possessed neither the experience nor the authority to resolve the manifold crises that Akhenaten's revolution had created, yet the regents who guided his early reign understood that Egypt's survival depended upon swift and decisive action to restore the traditional order that had sustained pharaonic civilization for millennia. The restoration began symbolically with the young pharaoh's name change from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling the abandonment of his predecessor's religious revolution and the return to traditional Egyptian theological concepts. This change represented more than mere political expediency. It constituted a fundamental rejection of the monotheistic experiment that had convulsed Egypt for nearly 2 decades, while proclaiming the restoration of the ancient compact between Pharaoh and gods that had guaranteed Egypt's prosperity since the time of Narmer. The restoration, stela erected at Karnak during Tutankhamun's reign, provides a comprehensive account of the religious and political reforms that accompanied the return to orthodoxy. The inscription describes a kingdom in ruins, with temples abandoned, gods forgotten, and traditional ceremonies neglected, while the new pharaoh is portrayed as the divine champion sent by the gods to restore Maat to the two lands. The stela's language deliberately echoes the propaganda of the Middle Kingdom reunification, presenting the restoration as a second unification that would return Egypt to its rightful place as the most favored of all lands. The physical return to Thebes from the abandoned city of Amarna required enormous logistical effort, as the royal court government bureaucracy and religious establishment had to be relocated while the new capital was being prepared to receive them. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, neglected during the Amarna period, required extensive restoration and rededication ceremonies that proclaimed the return of the traditional gods, while erasing as far as possible the memory of the heretical interlude that had preceded the restoration. The young pharaoh's regents, led by the elderly courtier Ai and the general Horemheb, understood that religious restoration alone would not solve the manifold problems that Egypt faced. The empire's Asian territories had been lost or were in rebellion. Nubian gold mines had fallen under local control, and Egypt's international prestige had suffered irreparable damage. The restoration government faced the daunting task of rebuilding Egyptian power while managing the domestic consequences of nearly 2 decades of revolutionary upheaval. Military campaigns became an immediate priority as Egyptian armies had to demonstrate that the kingdom's power remained undiminished despite the apparent weakness that the Amarna period had revealed. Tutankhamun's generals, including the future pharaoh Horemheb, launched expeditions into Nubia and Palestine that achieved limited tactical successes while failing to restore the comprehensive imperial control that earlier pharaohs had maintained. These campaigns, commemorated in temple reliefs that followed traditional artistic conventions, served important propaganda purposes even when their strategic achievements remained modest. The restoration of traditional artistic and architectural styles required the retraining of craftsmen who had spent their careers working in the revolutionary Amarna manner, creating workshops that could produce monuments worthy of a restored pharaonic state. The artistic program that emerged during Tutankhamun's reign deliberately emphasized continuity with pre-Amarna traditions while incorporating subtle innovations that reflected the experiences of the revolutionary period. The famous treasures from the young pharaoh's tomb demonstrate the extraordinary artistic achievements that this synthesis produced. Tutankhamun's premature death at approximately 18 years of age, possibly from injuries sustained in a chariot accident or from complications related to genetic disorders resulting from royal inbreeding, created another succession crisis that threatened to undo the restoration's achievements. The circumstances surrounding his death remain mysterious, with some evidence suggesting possible murder, while other indicators point to accidental death or natural causes related to the physical abnormalities that appear to have characterized the late 18th dynasty royal family. The young pharaoh's widow, Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and sister wife to Tutankhamun, made a desperate attempt to preserve her position by writing to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma requesting marriage to one of his sons. This unprecedented appeal to a foreign ruler for protection reveals both the weakness of the Egyptian royal family and the international dimensions of Egypt's internal crisis. The murder of the Hittite prince, while en route to Egypt, eliminated this possibility while creating diplomatic tensions that would plague Egyptian-Hittite relationships for generations. The brief reign of Ai, who claimed the throne by marrying Ankhesenamun and ruling for only 4 years, represented a temporary expedient that maintained the restoration's momentum while preparing the way for more substantial changes. Ai's background as a courtier rather than a military leader made him unsuitable for the aggressive policies that Egypt's situation required, yet his intimate knowledge of court politics and religious traditions enabled him to maintain stability during a crucial transitional period. The death of Ai in 1319 BCE brought to power Horemheb, the general who had served as the real architect of the military aspects of the restoration and who possessed both the experience and the authority necessary to complete the work of rebuilding Egyptian power. His coronation marked the end of the 18th dynasty and the beginning of the 19th dynasty, though Horemheb's lack of royal blood forced him to adopt the fiction that he was the legitimate successor to Amenhotep III, completely erasing the Amarna period from official Egyptian history. Horemheb's reign focused on the systematic reconstruction of Egyptian governmental and military institutions while pursuing aggressive policies designed to restore Egypt's international position. His domestic reforms included the promulgation of legal codes that strengthened royal authority while protecting ordinary Egyptians from official corruption, the reorganization of the army along professional lines that would make it more effective in future campaigns, and the completion of the religious restoration through extensive temple building and the persecution of remaining Atenist sympathizers. The new pharaoh's military background shaped his approach to imperial problems, as he understood that Egypt's Asian territories could be recovered only through sustained military pressure, combined with diplomatic initiatives that exploited divisions among Egypt's enemies. His campaigns in Palestine and Syria achieved limited success, recovering some territory while demonstrating that Egyptian military power remained formidable despite the setbacks of the Amarna period. Horemheb's most lasting achievement was the establishment of governmental institutions and military traditions that would enable his successors to launch the aggressive campaigns that would restore Egyptian imperial dominance. His appointment of Paramessu, a fellow military officer, as vizier and heir apparent, ensured continuity of policy while providing the 19th dynasty with a founder who possessed both the experience and the dynastic connections necessary to sustain the restoration's momentum. The transition from Horemheb to Ramesses II in 1292 BCE proceeded smoothly, as the new pharaoh had been carefully prepared for his role while serving as vizier and military commander under his predecessor. Though his reign lasted only 2 years, Ramesses I established the foundations for the 19th dynasty's greatest achievements while beginning the process of imperial reconstruction that his son and grandson would complete. Seti I, who succeeded his father in 1290 BCE, inherited both the restored governmental system that Horemheb had created and the military challenges that remained from the empire's collapse during the Amarna period. His reign marked the beginning of Egypt's last great imperial age, as the pharaoh's campaigns in Palestine, Syria, and Nubia restored Egyptian control over most of the territories that had been lost, while establishing new defensive systems that would protect the empire against future challenges. The pharaoh's military innovations included the development of new siege techniques that enabled Egyptian armies to capture fortified cities more efficiently, the creation of professional units specialized in different types of warfare, and the establishment of supply systems that could support prolonged campaigns far from Egypt's borders. These developments restored Egyptian military superiority while providing the tools that would enable Seti's successor to achieve even greater conquests. Seti I's building projects, including his magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Kings and his mortuary temple at Abydos, demonstrated both the restoration of Egypt's economic prosperity and the pharaoh's commitment to traditional religious values. The Abydos temple, dedicated to Osiris and decorated with reliefs of unprecedented beauty and precision, served as a statement of orthodox religious belief while providing a venue for rituals that strengthened the pharaoh's connection to the divine realm. The king list at Abydos, which carefully omitted the names of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun I, and other rulers associated with the Amarna period, represented the official attempt to erase the memory of the religious revolution while creating an idealized version of Egyptian history that emphasized continuity and divine sanction. This historical revisionism served important political purposes while establishing precedents for royal propaganda that would influence Egyptian historical writing for centuries. Seti I's diplomatic initiatives proved as important as his military campaigns as he negotiated treaties and alliances that stabilized Egypt's international position while preparing for the greater challenges that would face his successor. His correspondence with Hittite rulers laid the groundwork for the eventual peace treaty that would end the long conflict between these great powers, while his relationships with Mesopotamian kingdoms provided intelligence about political developments that could affect Egyptian interests. The pharaoh's death in 1279 BCE brought to the throne his son, Ramesses II, who would rule for 66 years and achieve a level of fame that would make him the most celebrated of all pharaohs. Yet, Ramesses II's achievements built upon the foundations that the Restoration pharaohs had laid, demonstrating that even Egypt's greatest rulers depended upon the institutional and cultural traditions that had sustained pharaonic civilization through its darkest hours. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1274 BCE between Ramesses II and the Hittite King Muwatalli, represented both the culmination of Egypt's imperial restoration and the beginning of a new phase in international relations that would eventually lead to the first recorded peace treaty in human history. Though the battle's outcome remained inconclusive, with both sides claiming victory, it demonstrated that Egypt had regained its position as one of the ancient world's great military powers, while establishing the diplomatic framework that would govern Near Eastern politics for the remainder of the New Kingdom period. The peace treaty signed between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III in 1259 BCE marked a fundamental change in Egyptian foreign policy as the pharaoh abandoned the traditional goal of unlimited expansion in favor of a stable international system based on mutual recognition and shared interests. This treaty, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, established principles of international law that would influence diplomatic practices for millennia, while creating the stability that allowed both empires to focus on internal development and defense against new threats from the north and east. The death of Ramesses II in 12 and 13 BCE marked not merely the end of a long and glorious reign, but the beginning of Egypt's final act as an independent civilization. The great pharaoh's 66 years on the throne had witnessed the last flowering of Egyptian imperial power, the construction of monuments that rivaled those of the pyramid builders, and the establishment of international treaties that had brought unprecedented stability to the ancient Near East. Yet beneath the magnificent facade of Ramesside prosperity, forces were gathering that would soon shake the foundations of the civilized world and bring an end to the Bronze Age empires that had dominated human history for over a millennium. Merneptah, 13th son of Ramesses II, and an old man when he finally inherited the throne at nearly 60 years of age, faced challenges that would have tested even the greatest of pharaohs in their prime. The Libyan tribes of the Western Desert, armed with new weapons and reinforced by mysterious warriors from across the Mediterranean, had begun launching devastating raids into the fertile Delta region, threatening the agricultural heartland that sustained Egypt's prosperity. These were not the traditional Libyan incursions that earlier pharaohs had easily repelled, but coordinated military campaigns that employed innovative tactics and superior metallurgy to achieve unprecedented success against Egyptian border defenses. The enemy forces that Merneptah's armies encountered in 1208 BCE represented something entirely new in Egyptian military experience. Alongside familiar Libyan warriors marched contingents of foreigners whose very names were unknown to Egyptian scribes, the Peleset, Jeka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. These sea peoples, as modern historians would later call them, brought with them military technologies and tactical innovations that challenged every assumption upon which Egyptian defensive planning had been based. The great battle fought in the Western Delta against this confederation of enemies tested Egyptian military capabilities to their limits, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of pharaonic military organization when properly led and supplied. Merneptah's victory, commemorated in detailed reliefs and inscriptions that provide invaluable information about these mysterious invaders, temporarily secured Egypt's borders while revealing the magnitude of the threat that was building across the Mediterranean world. The victory, stela that Merneptah erected at Karnak to celebrate his triumph, contains the first known reference to Israel in any ancient text mentioning the destruction of this people, along with other enemies who had dared to challenge Egyptian authority. This casual reference to what would become one of history's most significant peoples demonstrates both the extent of Egyptian imperial reach and the pharaoh's confidence that his victories had restored the traditional order that guaranteed Egypt's security and prosperity. Yet, even as Merneptah celebrated his military successes, reports reached the pharaoh's court of catastrophes that were overwhelming the civilized world beyond Egypt's borders. The great Hittite Empire, Egypt's rival and eventual ally in the struggles for control of the Levant, faced invasions from the north that threatened to destroy the kingdom that had dominated Anatolia for centuries. Mycenaean Greek civilization was collapsing under pressure from invaders who burned palaces and cities throughout the Aegean world, while the sophisticated trading networks that had connected the Mediterranean civilizations for generations were being systematically destroyed. The pharaoh's diplomatic correspondence during his final years reveals increasing desperation among Egypt's traditional allies and trading partners as rulers who had once commanded vast territories pleaded for Egyptian military assistance against enemies they could not identify or understand. The king of Ugarit, whose city had served as one of the ancient world's most important commercial centers, sent increasingly frantic messages describing sea-borne invasions that threatened to destroy his kingdom entirely. These appeals for help demonstrated both the extent of the crisis that was engulfing the Bronze Age world and Egypt's increasingly isolated position as the last great power capable of mounting effective resistance. The death of Merneptah in 1202 BCE plunged Egypt into a succession crisis that reflected the broader instability afflicting the entire region. His designated heir, Seti Daib, faced challenges from rival claimants, including Amenmesse, who controlled Upper Egypt, while Seti Tiku's authority remained confined to the Delta region and Middle Egypt. This civil war, lasting several years and consuming resources that Egypt desperately needed for external defense, demonstrated how the pressures of the age were affecting even the most stable and well-organized ancient states. The reunification achieved by Seti II proved temporary, as his death after only 6 years of rule brought another period of contested succession that saw the throne pass through several weak rulers before finally settling upon Ramesses III, a pharaoh who would prove to be Egypt's last great native warrior king. His accession in 1186 BCE came at the darkest hour in Egyptian history since the Hyksos invasion, as the forces that had destroyed the Hittite Empire and devastated the Aegean world were now turning their attention toward the rich lands of the Nile Valley. Ramesses III's first great test came in the 5th year of his reign, when a massive confederation of sea peoples launched a coordinated assault on Egypt by land and sea. This invasion represented the culmination of the population movements and military campaigns that had been building for decades throughout the eastern Mediterranean, as the survivors of destroyed civilizations joined with opportunistic raiders to create military forces of unprecedented size and capability. The reliefs carved on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu provide the most detailed visual record of ancient naval warfare ever discovered, depicting Egyptian ships engaging enemy vessels in battles that would determine the fate of pharaonic civilization. These scenes reveal tactical innovations on both sides, as Egyptian naval commanders adapted traditional riverine fighting techniques to cope with seagoing enemies who employed different ship designs, eshayans, and combat methods than any the pharaohs had previously encountered. The land battle that accompanied the naval engagement demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Egyptian military organization and the revolutionary changes that were transforming ancient warfare. The Sea Peoples employed iron weapons that proved superior to traditional bronze armaments, while their tactical formations and siege techniques reflected military innovations that had been developed during their conquest of other civilizations. Egyptian victory required not only tactical brilliance, but also the mobilization of resources on a scale that strained even Egypt's vast capabilities. Ramesses III's triumph over the Sea Peoples represented more than a military victory. It constituted the successful defense of the last Bronze Age civilization against forces that had destroyed every other major power of the ancient world. Yet this victory came at enormous cost, as the resources required for the campaign exhausted Egypt's treasury, while the destruction of trading partners and allies eliminated many of the commercial relationships that had sustained Egyptian prosperity for centuries. The pharaoh's subsequent campaigns against Libyan invaders and Asiatic rebels demonstrated that Egypt's military capabilities remained formidable, but they also revealed the changed strategic environment that Egyptian imperialism now faced. The destruction of the great powers that had previously balanced Egyptian influence meant that pharaonic armies now operated in a political vacuum where traditional diplomatic methods no longer applied, and where military victory could not be converted into the stable tributary relationships that had characterized earlier imperial expansion. The economic consequences of these military campaigns proved as significant as their immediate political results, as Egypt's traditional sources of wealth gradually disappeared under the pressure of international chaos. The Nubian gold mines, already showing signs of exhaustion after centuries of intensive exploitation, became increasingly difficult to operate, as local populations took advantage of Egyptian weakness to assert their independence. Trade routes that had carried exotic goods from throughout the known world were disrupted by piracy and political instability, while the markets for Egyptian manufactured goods disappeared along with the civilizations that had previously purchased them. Ramesses III's building projects, including the magnificent mortuary temple at Medinet Habu and additions to the great temples at Karnak and Luxor, demonstrated both the pharaoh's determination to maintain traditional standards of royal magnificence and the enormous costs that such projects imposed upon an increasingly strained economy. These monuments, while architecturally impressive and artistically sophisticated, represented investments that Egypt could ill afford at a time when military expenses were consuming ever larger portions of the royal treasury. The domestic crisis that erupted during Ramesses III's later years reflected the broader economic and social pressures that were transforming Egyptian society under the impact of external threats and reduced prosperity. The first recorded strike in human history, organized by the workers who were building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, demonstrated how economic difficulties were affecting even the most privileged segments of Egyptian society, while revealing new forms of social organization that challenged traditional hierarchical relationships. The harem conspiracy that nearly cost Ramesses III his life represented an even more serious threat to pharaonic authority, as court officials and royal women attempted to alter the succession in favor of a candidate who might prove more amenable to their interests. The detailed records of the legal proceedings that followed the conspiracy's discovery provide invaluable insights into the political tensions that were developing within the royal court, while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Egyptian judicial institutions even during periods of crisis. The assassination attempt's failure and the subsequent executions of the conspirators temporarily restored stability to the royal court. But the underlying problems that had motivated the conspiracy remained unresolved. The pharaoh's death in 1155 BCE brought to the throne Ramesses IV, who inherited not only the traditional challenges of pharaonic rule, but also the specific difficulties created by Egypt's changed position in a world where the old certainties no longer applied. The reigns of the later Ramessids, numbered from I-4 through 11, witnessed the gradual decline of pharaonic power as successive rulers proved incapable of solving the fundamental problems that afflicted Egyptian civilization. These pharaohs, while maintaining the traditional forms and ceremonies of divine kingship, presided over a kingdom whose actual authority was shrinking with each passing generation as provincial governors, military commanders, and high priests asserted increasing independence from central control. The growing power of the Theban priesthood, particularly the high priests of Amun, who controlled vast temple estates and commanded the loyalty of significant military forces, represented a fundamental challenge to the centralized authority that had characterized Egyptian government since the Old Kingdom. These religious officials, while theoretically subordinate to pharaonic authority, possessed independent sources of wealth and power that enabled them to pursue policies that sometimes conflicted with royal interests. The economic crisis that intensified during the late Ramesside period reflected both Egypt's isolation from disrupted international trade networks and the increasing costs of maintaining military establishments that were no longer generating the conquests and tribute that had previously justified their expense. Royal inscriptions from this period reveal pharaohs who were forced to make increasingly desperate appeals to divine favor while implementing austerity measures that reduced the scale and magnificence of traditional royal activities. The final collapse of New Kingdom authority came not through foreign conquest or natural catastrophe, but through the gradual fragmentation of central control as regional power centers asserted their independence from weakened pharaonic authority. By 1077 BCE, Egypt had effectively divided into separate kingdoms, ruled by competing dynasties that claimed legitimate succession to the pharaonic tradition while controlling territories that approximated the boundaries of the original kingdoms that Nama had united nearly 2 millennia earlier. The fragmentation of Egypt that followed the collapse of the New Kingdom marked not the end of pharaonic civilization, but its transformation into something entirely different from the unified state that had dominated the ancient world for over 2 millennia. The Third Intermediate Period, as scholars would later call this age of division, witnessed the emergence of competing dynasties that ruled simultaneously from different centers while maintaining the fiction that each represented the legitimate continuation of pharaonic tradition. These rival pharaohs, ruling from Tanis in the north and Thebes in the south, presided over territories whose boundaries shifted constantly as military fortunes changed and political alliances formed and dissolved. The 21st dynasty, established by Smendes at Tanis around 1077 BCE, controlled Lower Egypt and parts of Middle Egypt through a combination of military force and diplomatic accommodation with the Theban priesthood that had become the dominant power in Upper Egypt. These northern pharaohs, while maintaining royal titles and building programs, ruled over a kingdom whose actual authority extended little beyond the Delta region and whose resources were insufficient to support the elaborate court ceremonies and monumental construction projects that had characterized earlier periods of pharaonic rule. Simultaneously, the high priests of Amun at Thebes ruled Upper Egypt as virtual pharaohs, adopting royal prerogatives while maintaining the fiction that they served as regents for the northern pharaohs. This unprecedented arrangement reflected the changed balance of power within Egyptian society as religious institutions that had accumulated vast wealth and military capabilities during the New Kingdom period now commanded resources that rivaled or exceeded those of the traditional royal establishment. The Renaissance that began under the 22nd dynasty pharaohs, established by Shoshenq around 945 BCE, represented Egypt's last attempt to restore the unified authority and international influence that had characterized the great periods of pharaonic history. These rulers descended from Libyan military settlers who had been incorporated into Egyptian society during the New Kingdom period, combined traditional pharaonic legitimacy with the military innovations and organizational methods that their ancestors had brought from the desert peoples who had once threatened Egyptian security. Shoshenq I's campaign into Palestine around 925 BCE, commemorated in reliefs at Karnak, that deliberately echoed the victory monuments of New Kingdom pharaohs, achieved temporary success in restoring Egyptian influence over territories that had been lost since the Sea People's invasions. The pharaoh's forces captured Jerusalem and other important cities while imposing tribute obligations that briefly restored the flow of Asiatic wealth that had sustained earlier Egyptian prosperity. Yet these military successes proved ephemeral as Egypt lacked the resources and administrative capabilities necessary to maintain effective control over distant territories. The rise of the Assyrian Empire, with its professional armies and sophisticated siege techniques, created a Near Eastern power that could challenge Egyptian interests, while Egypt's internal divisions prevented the coordinated response that effective imperial policy required. The biblical account of Pharaoh Shoshenq's invasion, preserved in the books of Kings and Chronicles, provides external confirmation of Egyptian military activities, while revealing how dramatically Egypt's international position had declined since the great days of Thutmose III and Ramesses II. Where earlier pharaohs had been acknowledged as equals by Mesopotamian kings, the 22nd dynasty rulers were increasingly viewed as regional powers whose influence was confined to their immediate neighborhoods. The gradual dissolution of central authority that characterized the later Third Intermediate Period saw Egypt divide into ever smaller territories ruled by competing dynasties that claimed pharaonic legitimacy while controlling resources insufficient to support traditional royal activities. The 23rd, 24th, and 25th dynasties ruled simultaneously from different centers, creating a political fragmentation that made coordinated action impossible, while providing opportunities for foreign intervention that earlier pharaohs would have been able to prevent. The Kushite conquest of Egypt, completed by Piye around 727 BCE, brought to power rulers who ironically proved more committed to traditional Egyptian religious and cultural values than many of their native predecessors. These Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, ruling from their capital at Napata near the Fourth Cataract, launched an ambitious program of temple restoration and religious reform that consciously echoed the achievements of earlier pharaonic periods while adapting traditional institutions to the changed conditions of the Iron Age world. Taharqa, the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs, ruled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, temporarily restoring Egyptian control over territories that had been lost for centuries. His building projects throughout Egypt and Nubia demonstrated both the wealth that his kingdom had accumulated and his commitment to the pharaonic traditions that legitimized his rule over territories far removed from his ancestral homeland. Yet, even Taharqa's achievements could not restore Egypt's position as a dominant Mediterranean power, as the rising Assyrian Empire under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal possessed military capabilities that exceeded anything the Kushite pharaohs could mobilize. The Assyrian invasions of Egypt in 671 and 663 BCE demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most successful restoration efforts when confronted by enemies who commanded superior resources and more advanced military technology. The Assyrian occupation of Memphis and Thebes, accompanied by the systematic looting of temples and royal tombs that had accumulated treasures over millennia, marked the end of Egypt's independence as a great power, while initiating a period of foreign domination that would continue with brief interruptions until the Arab conquest in 641 CE. The destruction of Thebes in particular shocked the ancient world and inspired biblical prophecies that lamented the fall of the city that had been the symbol of Egyptian power and cultural achievement. The Saide Renaissance, that began with Psamtik around 664 BCE, represented Egypt's final attempt to restore native rule and traditional pharaonic institutions through a conscious program of archaizing reform that sought to recreate the achievements of earlier periods. These 26th dynasty pharaohs ruling from Sais in the delta with Assyrian support that gradually transformed into genuine independence initiated cultural and religious revivals that deliberately imitated Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom precedents while adapting ancient traditions to contemporary conditions. Psamtik I's long reign of 54 years allowed him to consolidate control over all of Egypt while rebuilding the military and administrative institutions necessary for effective governance. His employment of Greek mercenaries and Phoenician naval specialists demonstrated the cosmopolitan nature of Sate Egypt, where foreign expertise was welcomed as long as it served pharaonic interests and did not threaten traditional cultural values. The pharaoh's diplomatic initiatives established Egypt as a significant player in the complex international relationships that characterized the Near East during the Neo-Babylonian period, as Saite pharaohs formed alliances with Lydian kings, Greek city-states, and other powers that sought to contain Mesopotamian expansion. These relationships brought Egypt into contact with intellectual and artistic traditions that enriched pharaonic culture, while maintaining the distinctive character that had defined Egyptian civilization for millennia. Necho III's attempt to restore Egyptian control over Palestine and Syria, culminating in his victory over King Josiah of Judah at Megiddo in 609 BCE, briefly revived pharaonic imperialism while demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Egyptian military organization when properly led and equipped. Yet this success proved temporary as the rising Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II possessed resources that far exceeded anything Egypt could mobilize. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar defeated the combined Egyptian and Assyrian forces, marked the definitive end of Egyptian imperial ambitions in Asia, while establishing Babylonian hegemony over the territories that had once acknowledged pharaonic supremacy. This defeat forced Egypt to abandon its traditional role as a Near Eastern great power, while focusing on the defense of its own territory against increasingly sophisticated enemies. The Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE, achieved by Cambyses II after the Battle of Pelusium, brought pharaonic independence to an end while initiating a period of foreign rule that would continue with brief interruptions for nearly 14 centuries. The Persian pharaohs of the 27th dynasty maintained traditional Egyptian institutions while integrating the kingdom into the vast administrative system of the Achaemenid Empire, creating a hybrid form of government that preserved pharaonic ceremonies while serving imperial rather than purely Egyptian interests. The native Egyptian revolts that periodically challenged Persian rule, most notably those that established the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, demonstrated the persistence of pharaonic traditions while revealing their increasing irrelevance to the broader political and military developments that were reshaping the ancient world. These brief periods of restored independence, lasting from 404 to 342 BCE, saw ambitious building projects and religious reforms that consciously imitated earlier pharaonic achievements while lacking the resources and strategic position necessary for sustained success. The Second Persian conquest in 342 BCE eliminated the last native Egyptian dynasty and paved the way for Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE, an event that would transform pharaonic civilization more profoundly than any previous foreign occupation. Alexander's respectful treatment of Egyptian religious traditions and his pilgrimage to the oracle of Amurg at Siwa demonstrated his understanding of the symbolic importance of pharaonic legitimacy while establishing precedents that his successors would follow. The Ptolemaic dynasty, established by Alexander's general Ptolemy I after the conqueror's death, ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, while maintaining pharaonic institutions within a fundamentally Greek governmental and cultural framework. These Macedonian pharaohs, ruling from their new capital at Alexandria, presided over a kingdom that was Egyptian in name and ceremony, but Greek in administration and high culture, creating a synthesis that preserved ancient traditions while adapting them to Hellenistic conditions. The reign of Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, represented both the final flowering of Ptolemaic achievement and the inevitable conclusion of pharaonic independence in a world dominated by Rome's inexorable expansion. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony demonstrated the subordinate position that even the most capable Egyptian rulers now occupied in Mediterranean politics, while her suicide in 30 BCE marked the end of pharaonic rule that had begun with Narmer's unification over 3 millennia earlier. The Roman annexation of Egypt transformed the ancient kingdom into a province that served primarily as a source of grain for the imperial capital while maintaining traditional ceremonies and religious practices that had lost their political significance. The last hieroglyphic inscriptions carved at Philae in the 6th century CE marked the end of the writing system that had recorded pharaonic achievements for over 3,000 years, while the conversion of Egypt to Christianity eliminated the religious traditions that had sustained pharaonic civilization since its beginning. Yet, even as political independence ended and traditional institutions disappeared, the legacy of pharaonic Egypt continued to influence human civilization through the monuments, artistic traditions, and intellectual achievements that had been created during 3 millennia of pharaonic rule. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings remained as eternal witnesses to the achievements of a civilization that had touched the divine and created works that would inspire wonder and admiration for millennia to come. The story of ancient Egypt, from the unification of the 2 lands to the death of Cleopatra, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, the creation of a civilization that sustained itself for over 3,000 years while producing cultural, artistic, and intellectual works that continue to influence human development. Though the pharaohs have long since joined their gods in the eternal realm beyond the western horizon, their legacy endures in the stones they carved, the wisdom they preserved, and the example they provided of what human civilization could achieve when guided by divine inspiration and sustained by the eternal rhythms of the sacred Nile. The sun has set on the age of pharaohs, but their light continues to illuminate the path of human achievement, reminding future generations that mortals can indeed touch eternity and create works worthy of the gods themselves.